Today's webinar developed for you by Reuters and Wiley Independent Medical Education. My name is Eva Nachtigal, Independent Medical Education Business Lead at Wiley. Joining me today in this panel discussion are Head of International Medical Affairs with VIV Healthcare, Tia Vincent, Nina Marovic-Martinko, Head of Medical Affairs, Adriatics and Portugal from Astellas Pharma, and last but certainly not least, Michael Zayek, Head of Medical Affairs, Oncology, Europe and Canada with Daiichi Sankyo. Welcome. And a very warm welcome to our viewers. We hope you will be enthused by our discussion today and that you will submit your questions for us to address during the 15-minute Q&A session at the end of our 45 minutes. During this webinar, we will discuss three key aspects of medical education: how to balance independence and company-led medical education to meet modern HCP demands, learn from real examples on effectively using educational content to engage HCPs who are trying to bridge the medical education gap and simultaneously improve patient outcomes. And lastly, thirdly, discover best practices for collaborating with independent medical education providers, such as Wiley, to ensure transparency and deliver content free from promotional bias. To start with our first topic, balancing independence and company-led medical education. Tia, if I might start with you. What are the key strategies that you found effective in balancing independence and company-led medical education initiatives, and what's worked for VIV Healthcare?
So thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here with everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. We've done all our sound checks and everything's good and in order. So this is a fantastic topic, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel, because actually there's nothing more important than thinking about the right way to approach medical education. And that is absolutely a composite of independent medical education and the medical education that each pharmaceutical company aspires to provide and provides to healthcare professionals. And so maybe just to give you a little bit of a flavor from VIV Healthcare before I dive into something more concrete. So in VIV Healthcare, we are a company that's 100% dedicated to HIV. And so all of the activities that we do are centered around care for people living with HIV and people who can benefit from prevention. And in that context, we have a very diverse group of countries that we serve in the region that I work in, the international region. So we work across not Europe and not the US, but the rest of the world. And as you can imagine, the educational needs that we have in a country as diverse as Japan compared to a country like South Africa, for example, are incredibly different. And to be able to best serve the offer of quality medical education, we need to combine activities that are partnering with IME providers, such as Wiley, but also with activities that we choose to lead. And so in order to make that best strategic decision around what fits where in each moment, the way that we do that is that we have a deep understanding of what the expectations and the needs and the unanswered questions are of the audience that we aim to reach. And then through that, we have very deep conversations with a variety of IME providers, as well as with our own teams globally and regionally, to decide in which approach we best are able to serve those educational needs that we identify through the research. So maybe this is a bit of a general topic, and let me pause there in order for you to be able to bring in some more of our panel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tia, for that introduction. And perhaps, Nina, I can ask you to talk to this point a little bit as well, because you also have a very specific region, Adriatics and Portugal. Is your experience the same, similar to what Tia describes, or do you have a different approach with Astellas?
Hello, my name is Nina Marovic-Martinko, and as you mentioned, I'm a head of medical affairs for Adriatics, meaning Slovenia and Croatia and Portugal. I have been working for Astellas for 10 years, and the last 5 years I'm at the position of head of medical. I also would like to express that this discussion is not intended for any purposes and does not replace any independent professional judgment, and that whatever any opinion I expressed are those that I individually I'm expressing by myself, and it doesn't mean that and not necessarily reflect the opinion and position of Astellas of any subsidiaries. This is something just to disclaim. So to answer on your question, I would really like to say that the experience I previously was head of medical for Adriatics and Baltics, covering 12 countries, both EU and non-EU, and now for including Portugal. So the experience with medical education is really diversified, but very important. And what we see that the assessing the gap in knowledge and competencies and performance is really crucial to be able to adapt all activities, including independent and company-organized education, and just to meet the needs in different specific countries. Very important, yes.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you also for that disclaimer, very important. I think that that's for everybody on this call. These are our personal views. This is a conversation informally.
Yeah.
Michael, perhaps I can just go to you and ask you, how does they actually determine the right mix of independent medical education versus company-driven education for HCPs? What does that look like?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me on the panel. For us, I think, okay, I have to also place a context, much like Tia did. I look after oncology products, and I do so for the last probably 20 years of my life. I'm an oncologist by training, so and it might be slightly different for each particular subject, but of course, medical affairs is three things. It's insight generation, it's evidence generation, and it's communication. And communication is, of course, perhaps our most volume-wise, our most demanding area. And hence, medical education is key for us. And in oncology, what I've found really useful is to look at the life cycle of the product. So when we start with a product, often independent medical education is the right start, because we are often in a pre-licensed setting. We don't want to appear as teasing or setting the environment. We just want to provide real useful information. Then I think when it comes to launch, we're often somewhat heavier on company-led medical education. When we then come more into the life cycle, we're almost exclusively into independent medical education. Why? I think in oncology especially, but also I guess in other therapeutic areas, many subjects are not one company specific. That's not what physicians, healthcare professionals want to hear. They want to hear a broad information about how products combine, how side effects and combination issues are managed. And we find that is best being provided ideally in a multi-company sponsored environment through an independent medical education provider. So for us, the choice and the balance changes a little bit according to the life cycle the product is in.
Yeah, that's very interesting to learn. Now, I suspect that that may be the same for both yourselves, Tia and Nina, but perhaps, Tia, maybe you have a completely different look on this because you do work in HIV solely. What's your take on this?
Yeah, that's great. And I actually love what Michael was saying. I was taking notes myself here around the different approaches. I don't think we have I don't think I've considered it in the way of a very structured approach of pre-launch, launch, but I completely agree with the points that Michael raised. I think the part that's really interesting to bring in is reach. So an element to consider is depending on what the reach one is trying to achieve, there are different means in order to execute that. And so, for example, partnering with an established IME provider that is able to reach a greater number of healthcare professionals that we wish to reach is a very good way to still continue that educational activity. And then the other thing that I think is very relevant is to think about language barriers. So, for example, if we want to provide an educational activity that reaches people in different cultures and different languages, then quite often it's a more efficient way to do that through an independent medical education partnership versus a more bespoke company-wide. But I really think the key message for me is knowing your audience. So being very clear, what are you trying to communicate and who are you trying to communicate it to? And that kind of determines then the choices that you make further down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think reach is a very important aspect of this, and actually leads nicely into a question that I wanted to ask Nina anyway, is that, I'm curious to understand what criteria does Astellas use to assess the needs and preferences of HCPs when it comes to education, and what sort of formats and types do you find are of interest to them, and how do you decide which are best, I suppose, positioned to convey IME or company-led education?
Yeah. So first, I would like to stress that the number of new medical information is growing exponentially. So the last info that we are using, that it is doubling every 73 days, but this info was, or this calculation was made actually two years ago. So I'm pretty much sure that currently the medical information quantity is doubling much faster. So on one side we have this, and another side what we have, this is the new generation and new technology. So we know that from some publication at the end of last year that 95% of HCPs, of physicians, wish actually to learn and to get the new information, because otherwise they won't be able to go with that fast development. That 80% is doing that during their free time out of working hours, which is very important too. And due to that, more than 80% is using internet. So that is something basically what we learned and what we know. What we also know is that still doctors need face-to-face or interactions, at least discussion, just to improve the critical view of some medical topics. And from other side, they really need we are calling it findable, so easy to find, interactive, and on demand some information that we are using. So to decide how we will approach, we are using some medical information queries, MSL insights, medical information surveys, or some information that we are getting during advisory boards, but also from external sources, from some guidelines that some communities, medical societies are setting as their guidelines for their education, and also discussing with KAEs. So there is a quite complex environment, and probably I put a lot of that on the table, but all of this actually somehow in some paths and the process we are using to decide how we will approach KEs and to healthcare professionals. And I need to say that more and more, due to complexity of data, we are using independent medical education, especially at the beginning, as Michael mentioned.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that elaborate answer. It's so interesting. And I realize we only have 45 minutes and I want to jump in and ask you more questions on this topic, but we have 2 other key points in this webinar that we still want to address. So I am going to move to the second topic, which is using educational content to engage HCPs and improve patient outcomes. And in this case, Michael, perhaps I can turn to you. Could you share examples of specific educational content that successfully engaged HCPs and that led to improved patient outcomes?
Great. So yeah, we have some very worked examples, and I sort of provided a little bit of a teaser in my introduction. Oncology medicines are highly effective. However, of course, with that efficacy also comes side effects. Side effects generally are, at least with the medicines I'm looking after at the moment, are progressive. So it means when they are stopped early, they can be stopped at a very low level and thankfully little affection to the patient, which means that we are very engaged to make sure that physicians know how to, not just physicians actually, we place a great deal of emphasis on all kinds of healthcare professionals, especially also nurses, that we have an early recognition of these side effects to stop them in their tracks. And that works highly successful through independent medical education providers. As I said, ideally in a multi-sponsored setting, because patients, of course, don't just get one oncology medication, they often get combinations of medications. Another example, which is more on the company side, which we run at large conferences, are workshops. We are, for the last 7-8 years, use advanced analytics, so if you wish, analytical AI, to identify patients at risk of failing treatment, in need of switching treatment. I guess what many of us do to look in our data and real-world data to really see, can we find stuff? And of course, advanced analytics, especially when we started some 7 years ago, was really a black box. And when we presented this, we had some conference posters and talks. And when we presented this, what we encountered was a lot, I don't understand this, how you did this, I don't believe in your data. And we were lucky, we got at some of the US conferences, we got the permission from the conference host to run workshops. And we really then brought the technology to the healthcare professionals. And that was a real eye-opener. So when we presented the data, the initial feedback, as I said, was we don't trust this kind of data. This is real-world data, black box analytics. We don't understand the mathematics behind it. A forest model in that case. And then we did a 2-hour workshop with about 50 healthcare professionals, and everybody left the room and said, wow, give me the algorithm. I want to try this on my patients. So these are some sort of contrasting events I can talk a little bit about in detail.
Yeah, fantastic. I very much appreciate the way that you combine the traditional by way of a conference with the innovative in analytics to reach your audience and to be able to educate further. So that's a very interesting aspect of what you've just described. Just moving on a little bit, what approach does Stellis take, Nina, to identify the gaps in medical education and create content that directly addresses these gaps? How do you go about this?
As I mentioned, we are using different sources of information, both internal and external. And the internal are our insights that people are collecting from the field, MSLs, but also some surveys, some post-educational surveys, which brings us a lot of insight about the needs, and also using external and communicating with some external opinion leaders and see where we need. Also, what we are using when the new molecules are opening the new chapters in the treatment. What is some diagnoses are, especially in oncology, Michael spoke quite a lot. So oncology is one chapter that is opening and developing very fast. And some indications didn't have proper treatment really because there was no option for it. And now we need to train both oncologists, but all other healthcare professionals, how to diagnose, treat, and follow up those patients. So not only patients, but also caregivers and patients should be trained. So it could be done only with independent medical education. And this is seen based on the area that we are investigating, and we are looking from all stakeholders to collect their needs and potential gaps.
Fantastic, fantastic. And Tia, we've touched on the topic of formats a little bit. Are there any specific IME or even company-led initiatives that you've found to be more effective than the other within ViiV?
I think the beauty of having a variety of formats and building on Nina's response about knowing what your audience wants is to be able to provide actually the educational content in the format that the audience you're looking to address wishes to have. So I'll give you an example. In some countries, we see a very strong preference for podcasts. And actually, people really much prefer to be able to have access to educational content on the go, where they can just put their earphones in, go for a walk, commute to work, but listen to that educational content in their own daily life. And then you have others who, and the other extreme perhaps, that would much rather sit in a room with peers and who have the opportunity to listen to a live presenter, but also to then engage one-to-one with the peers that are in the room. And so I think it's really crucial to be able to have that mapping of the audience you wish to reach, and to be able to say, you know, for this audience, a format such as a podcast is what they would best respond to, and then make an offering that fits with that. And likewise in all other preferences, to be able to serve the audience that you need. So I wouldn't say I would pick one. I know which one I would rather be a participant for, but I think it's important to know your audience. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then perhaps the obvious next question a little bit is then, are you also tracking metrics, for example, from your digital activities? What are you looking at to define success, I suppose, from, for example, a digital activity or a physical activity?
For me, shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I mean, this is really important, right? Because we put an awful lot of investment in medical education. And so it's really important to have measures that are able to capture for you what your impact intention was. And so for me, the obvious one is the attendance. Yes, you need to know the attendance, be it live, be it digital format, but you also then wish to know more detailed and qualitative things, like how does one's knowledge of the topic that you are discussing evolves based on having attended this course? What is the impact on patient care? Is a really important question. Is it the right person that you've managed to attract with that educational content? So if, for example, you're offering is one for newly qualified physicians in that space that you're working in, then are they the ones that you're reaching by the offering that you have? So making sure you have the reach that you intended, making sure that the educational content was valued, and ideally one that impacts patient care ultimately.
Yeah, very interesting. And Michael, does that sound the same for you? Is that a similar format that you would define success by?
Not much to add to what Tia said. I think the only thing which also plays in our mind, so we also try a multitude of offering, largely because we also acknowledge that our audience is changing rapidly. So I can say this, so I'm part of the baby boomer generation, and of course many of my colleagues in oncology are looking towards retirement, and whereas that generation still consumed largely in face-to-face settings, Generation Z, which will take over and will, I think, in the disciplines in medicine form 50% of our audience from maybe 3-4 years from the next decade onwards, are largely on-demand consumers. So we are looking a little bit, how are we shifting the formats and how can we provide better on-demand formats and perhaps generating independent content or consuming independent content through Gen AI systems, which allow the customers to put their content together at their will. So that's something we're exploring a little bit. And I think Tia illustrated perfectly what their KPIs are. I have to admit, we don't really have a perfect way to measure all these kind of things. What we would love to measure, so have we achieved an educational impact by asking outright the question, that never really works in all kinds of formats. So, but we were trying the same approach at what Tia has illustrated. We're asking, has the education had an impact? Well, has it reached the right audience, and has it had an impact on the clinical practice, or have you understood what the risk and benefits are, etc.? But we don't really have a perfect way of doing it, I have to admit. We're looking for solutions.
Absolutely, it's a difficult one to answer. I am aware of that. I think metrics are the key to a lot of these activities. So for what's already coming up to the final topic number 3, collaborating with independent medical education providers for transparency and non-biased content. Nina, if I could look at you, what steps do you take at Astellas to ensure transparency and eliminate promotional bias when working with an educational provider?
So we are using educational providers as medical education companies, mainly in the States. In Europe, only in few countries. I'm sorry. And but we are using in 2 different ways. One way is digital approach, when they have in internet on demand some trainings, and that is very measurable, and that is also very much could be unsolicited, but could be proactively, but mainly unsolicited, and also activating the working via grants with healthcare organization, healthcare institutions that we are providing grants, and they are giving independent education. So when we are speaking about companies, mainly we are using, as I told, through the digital way, and also there is option to having a Congress summary reviews that is also organized by third parties.
Yeah, and I think grants are absolutely an integral part of that process. You're absolutely right for bringing that point to the table. And Michael and Tia, do you have the same safeguards almost in place that Nina describes? Maybe Michael, I can ask you first.
Yeah, so we look at that we have a very transparent internal grant process, which goes through independent committees, and that we are very clear in the contractual agreements with the IME provider. And as I said, our strong preference is really to go to multi-company sponsored IME to make sure that we are not the only ones sponsoring. It happens, and sometimes it's appropriate, but it's always a little bit more difficult, I think, to truly demonstrate independence if it is just one company sponsor. So whenever possible, we love to collaborate with others to provide medical education and deliver probably what we feel is of more value also to the consumer, because they're not just prescribing one company's brands anyway. So if we can do it multi-sponsored, then we look for multi-sponsored.
Absolutely. Tia, is that the same for you?
I can't off the top of my head comment on the balance between the two, but I think there are, in all companies, I think we have safeguards to be able to be very clear. So it's important to be transparent and to disclose any support, but also to make sure that we work with providers who uphold those standards of transparency, of impartiality, of selection of truly expert scientific committees who can accurately reflect the advancements in clinical practice in the topic that we're talking about. And so those steps are important ones to always have in place, irrespective of whether you're doing it in partnership or whether you're doing it as an individual company sponsored.
A further question for you, Michael. How do you select independent medical education providers to work with, and what criteria are the most important to your organization?
Yeah, so we have, again, very transparent processes, purchasing processes, where we ask for an RFP, so request for proposals, and then look at, through a number of functions, at the reputation of the provider, as Tia already illustrated. We are looking, of course, at the cost. Budgets are always an issue. For us, often very important is expertise in the therapeutic area. So we generally tend to work with companies who work in oncology or have some demonstrable experience in oncology. Sometimes we make exceptions when we have providers who have a specific technology which provides us the reach Tia has illustrated, maybe to a younger audience, maybe to physicians who are just beginning and they have a specific audience or reach because of the methodology they use. But in principle, we are using people with expertise in the therapeutic area. And then, of course, it's a lot of personal experience. So repeat business then comes through personal experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and Nina, are those similar criteria to which you would uphold at Astellas? Would they be similar to what Michael describes?
Yeah, exactly. I think that scientific background, the expertise, and the history of independent medical education, the references, are the crucial when we are selecting the third party. Yes.
Yeah.
Or someone to do that. Yes.
Absolutely. So time is flying from the corner of my eye. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock. So I think we'll move on to what will probably perhaps be our last question. Tia, what measures or agreements are put in place to protect the objectivity of content when collaborating with IAB providers? We've talked about grants or other things that we need to keep in mind, or that would be beneficial for the audience today to understand?
Absolutely. So I think that's why the selection is so important, right? Because actually, in order to ensure that there is no question about the objectivity, it's really important that the company sponsoring the event has no input into the selection of the speakers, into the selection of the data that they utilize in order to support the points that made in that particular educational content. And so with that, it's really important to have that firewall, if you like. So we have policies in place, and I'm sure every company has, or certainly everyone I've worked in has policies in place to make sure that that is safeguarded, but also that it is auditable at a regular basis internally, to be able to make sure that we have those checks in place to go back and be able to reference that and demonstrate that. But that's really crucial, otherwise it's not independent.
Oh, exactly. No, absolutely. For Nina and Michael, I suppose the same question. Is there anything that in addition to what Tia's mentioned or what we've been discussing throughout this webinar, really, that you would like to bring forward to our viewers that they keep in mind when they are pursuing independent medical education programs with providers?
So if I can just jump, if we are giving a grant, grants regulates everything. So we don't have any influence on content, on speaker selection and of their presentations. And if we have a third party who is organizing that, the similar approach, but different reasons, yes.
Firstly, and Michael.
Yeah, I mean, for us the same, it's grants, contracts, and internal SOPs. Maybe what we take often great care is that the educational provider has a steering committee of independent physicians on board, selecting the right subject, the right way to approach it. So that's another strong point for us, that we are clear, because often, I mean, as Tia said, we get audited and we look, it's difficult to show that nothing has happened, because of course that's what we want. We want nothing happen between the IME and us, but to show that is not always easy. So what we often prefer is that the IME has an independent steering committee also of experts who decide on the subject, that there's clear documentation, often that we have been approached by the provider rather than we are approaching the provider, especially if we are going into single company sponsored IME. I think that's a couple of points I might want to add, in addition to really contracts, grant process, and SOPs.
Yeah. So in addition to really to reach with the audiences, innovative formats, from what I hear you all saying, you'd also want to be looking at a network, call it steering committee, call it network, really, of opinion leaders in specific areas of expertise, addressing those questions. That would be something that you would also keep at top of your list, I suppose, when you're reviewing the grants that are submitted. Is that also the same for you and Estellas, Nina?
Yes, for sure. This is actually very important to have a highly scientific background and huge experience, because this is something that could the best select the most important topics for addressing gaps in knowledge. Yeah, definitely.
And Tia, if I might ask you for some closing words.
On the topic of transparency specifically.
Well, and also I suppose of having a network. So if your independent education provider, for example, includes a network identifying opinion leaders in grant submissions, is that something? Is it a plus or would you prefer to steer away from that sort of information?
I think it's really valuable to have the experts in the field as part of the steering committee, because that's how you ensure the quality of the educational content, because you do have people who are familiar with the detailed context of the topic that you're looking at. And so absolutely, yeah, it's really, really important.
Fantastic. Now, I've seen there's also already quite a few questions coming in through the Q&A, which means that maybe we'll give a little bit more time to cover this aspect. So for now, I would like to thank you for this great conversation. We've come to the end of the panel discussion part of the call, but it's absolutely time to hear from our audience now. So addressing this to our audience, if you've not yet done so, please submit your questions and we'll try and get through as many as we can within the next sort of 20 minutes. I'm going to click the button for the Q&A that we can then see at our end and start picking away at the questions that have been submitted. The first one being, do you link any of your medical education to corporate social responsibility goals? For example, access to health? That's a very interesting one. Is there anyone who'd immediately like to answer this question?
Yeah, I mean, we again, it's difficult to measure these things, but as I alluded to, for us, it's not just important that our medicines are used, but that our medicines are used in the context of making patients feel better. So we are placing a great deal of emphasis on managing the health, selecting the right patients for the right treatment. Frailty is a big issue in oncology, but rarely measured. How do we identify patients with the least risk of receiving medicine, or that frail patients also receive the right medicines? The answer is yes. Can we truly measure it? Health goals, public health goals, difficult. I would say I haven't seen a convincing measure, but we are trying.
Fantastic. And Nina, do you have another angle on this social responsibility goals question?
Yes, I think this will be ideal if we will give independent education and it will increase access to the real products. Unfortunately, we are seeing in Europe, because I see that probably we see in Europe huge differences between different parts of Europe, and the access and based on medical education, based on knowledge that we have, and real possibility that patients receive. So I fully agree with Michael that it's very hard to be measured. But what we know from experience, that the access based on real need and knowledge of healthcare providers is really different between different parts.
Absolutely. Now, from the corner of my eye, I see there are quite a few questions around the impacts. Maybe I could start with the first one, Tia. What measurement tools do you use to assess impact? And I'm assuming of either company-led or independent medical education.
Yeah, and I think that question touches a little bit on the discussion we were having earlier around what can we put in place, and then to what degree is it accurate. So we do put in place measures, whether it's company-led or whether we're looking through our IME partners. We do look for whether we're reaching the right audience, and therefore have an extrapolation as to the impact, because it depends on whether those individuals can then take on the information and utilize it in their clinical settings. But also reporting on impact in clinical care. I think that's really, really crucial. Now, you know, for the skeptics, you can say, does a question asking someone, does it impact their care? Is it sufficient? But I think that's still a surrogate measure of intent. And so that's still a good question to ask and to capture. If anything, the piece that I'd love to hear some advice on is how to get the majority of the audience to give the feedback. in the first place. So I think a lot of us have good questions to ask. We don't always get full participation on the feedback. And so any tips from anybody on how to do that, I'm going to take notes.
Right, well, you've heard the call, people. Please submit the answer through the chat. We'd be very interested in the Q&A. I see there's another point again around impact of educational activities. And Michael, maybe I can address this to you. What have you found the most effective and compliant ways to measure impact of educational activities on patient care?
Yeah, it's essentially what Tia said. I mean, we are asking the same kind of question. How honest is it going to be answered? So we're asking, does it affect what you do in your clinical practice when you come home from a conference, if it was a symposium, or when you switch off the webinar? Does it affect what you do tomorrow? So we're asking very concrete, what do you do tomorrow differently to today? The other way also to measure impact for us is to try to get a debrief through the provider from the steering committee and say what does resonate. I mean, the steering committee is often also, of course, a consumer of the education. They are designing it, but they're also, of course, a consumer. And to come, what Tia said is absolutely right. Of course, feedback rates are maybe 1/3 of the audience will get feedback from, which is, I don't know, I hope it is representative, but we don't know it's a truthful answer. And we don't have, for sure, a better idea how to do it. We do the various survey methods electronically, short, to try to make it as easy as possible. But we're also trying to get a debrief of the steering committee, because, of course, they also consume what just was said. And that is sometimes also very useful. So that would be one advice to add to what Tia has already said.
Absolutely, no better test of the content than asking your opinion leaders to actually run through the program and take the assessment themselves, correct? I mean, they're part of the development, but ideally you'd like them to also take the steps to like I said, run through this program.
We often get feedback to say, people, look, I learned something, which then is, of course, really important.
Absolutely.
It's qualitative, it's small, but I believe often representative to what truly happens in the audience. So I think that's often good.
Certainly agree. Now, there's another question that's quite close to my heart, because one, I'm of course in the IME department, but I work for Wiley as a publisher. And this question is, are print educational materials still relevant in this day and age? Is there anyone who'd like to go first? Or is it just the publisher and me who gets enthusiastic?
I think it goes back to that point around knowing your audience, because I can think of examples in some of the countries, certainly in the region that I work in, where absolutely having something that you can hold on to and show to your colleague, or in fact show to your patient, is really important. And so those materials in that context are important. Would I go out and sort of spread around numerous publications on paper? Probably not, because not everyone responds to that. I know I don't carry lots of paper around with me these days, but knowing your audience and making the right offering for them will show you that actually in some cases print is necessary. Yeah.
It's around creating touch points, isn't it? So it's not just one vehicle that leads to a result. You want to have multiple touch points in the digital space, but certainly also the print space can be of absolute value.
And sometimes it might be tools as well. As I'm just saying this, I think about it myself. Sometimes it might be that you provide in print something that is a tool for the service that you're talking about through the educational content. So that's also helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So just scrolling through those questions now. As you were mentioning before, the amount of educational content is exponentially exploding. Do you see we as an industry have a role in aggregating content and seeking partnerships across the board, including among us to reduce the mountain of amounts we push to HCPs? So I suppose that's the mountain of content that we're pushing to HCPs. Perhaps Nina, you'd like to address this question first of all.
Yeah, I'm really fascinating about the amount of medical information that are doubling. And I think that we just need to start using AI for the customizing medical education content and adapting it to the real need. That we spoke quite a lot about the identifying the gaps, needs, etc. So using AI as a tool that customize all these informations and adapt, and no possibility to share information, very important to choose the right information and the most important. Because otherwise, what we know that all of us are overloaded with a lot of informations, and unfortunately, a lot of these informations are unnecessary or just we cannot apply. So very, very strict selection, I will say.
Absolutely. And the next question, interestingly, is for all the panelists. So I'm going to ask this to you and then ask in a clockwise, for me at least, fashion to answer them. Speaking about IME in EU, can you comment on how you deal with content localization to local languages and what criteria do you consider here? Now, Michael, you're the first in my clockwise rotation.
Yeah, so localization, I guess in the world of oncology, and that might be specific to oncology, English is the language we provide most of the stuff we target physicians. However, we do acknowledge very much when we then go to nurses that localization in languages is preferential. So again, we look very much at our audience, whether or not we localize medical education to a different language. And then, of course, we would provide it generally in the big European languages. English, French, German would be normally our provision. But again, for physicians, we are almost, and I'm racking my brain, I think we are almost always just stick with English because that's generally in oncology acceptable. But for other healthcare providers, nurses, but also pharmacists, we often localize at least parts of the education offering into their local language. And we found from feedback, again, from talking to the audience, from receiving feedback, that is perceived as appropriate by the audiences.
And Nina, how is that for you?
Honestly, it could be like Michael just explained, but some countries required due to local legislation to be translated to local language. So we are using providers to do that, and they are helping us a lot. So this is how, and we are if there is independent, then we don't have any influence. We are just asking to be on the local language. If there is in our scope, then we are approving.
Fantastic. Tia?
So I think a lot has been covered already, and I'm trying to think back to the days when my remit was in the EU. We did have times when we would localize content, and as Nina clarified, when it's through the IME provider, then that's a conversation we have with them. But then when it's an offering that we would have as a company ourselves, then we would probably make sure that we select those where we think that content is most relevant. And if we identify that there is a need in local language, we can do that. I think it's been peppered throughout the conversation here today, but the use of technology has enabled a much faster way to do that, right? So it has sort of given us the opportunity to be able to very quickly localize compared to certainly back when I started working in pharma, where you had to literally get a translator in with you to do everything from scratch.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the next question is something that we've also discussed a little bit during the conversation, is around the segmentation of audiences. And the question here is, what strategies have you found most effective for engaging physicians? And then they're specifically asking around junior doctors in online medical education. I've heard podcasts was mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation. I'm not sure if that was specifically for junior doctors or it's just been found to be a format that appeals. But is there anything in this space that you could share regarding this audience? Nina?
I like Z generation because they are the youngest. And they actually grew up with this explosion of new information. And for them, it's normal. They are asking for short info, most wanted videos and short messages on demand. And interactive. So this is something that we are segmenting when we are thinking about younger generation. About mid-generation, podcasts and webinars and that on demand, and elder, as Michael explained, they prefer face-to-face. Sorry, it's a very, very, very high level, but in general, that is somehow the starting point. Then we can go deeply.
Yeah. And Tia, did you mention the podcast or was it
I
Michael?
did.
I'm not quite sure. So I'm curious, so how did you decide on a podcast? Was that because of the audience or how was that developed?
We do take the time to identify the channel preferences for the audience that we wish to reach. And so by having that information, then you're able to tailor your offerings to that audience, right? And so I agree with Nina in the way it was broadly categorized, but obviously then when you dig in deeper to your individual audience, it's important to be able to capture their channel preference. And then, like with all of us, right, we're all human. We like to be offered things that we want rather than things that we want to throw away. So it's human nature. Segmentation's important.
Yes, for sure. Then if I just move on to the next question, I think this might be the final question looking at the time. Today we've heard about independent versus company-led, but is there a third option these leaders are using that meets in the middle, e.g. collaboration and support for societies where the company has some input on topics, faculty selection, and is this perhaps the most effective tactic? So there's a multi-layer question there. Who'd like to start? Michael, could I ask you first?
Yeah, I think as long as it is transparent, in this case, it wouldn't be independent medical education if we define the topic. I think it might still be very valuable, and we might ask a learned society organizing a conference to do something, but it needs to be upfront that it was then initiated by us. So I think this is all about having the right communication, having the right context for such an event. I think the event might be superb, but it needs to be clear that it is not entirely independent. So it's company sponsored, it would be approved, reviewed under the company sponsored medical education rules, and therefore to a degree, I guess, limited in what's being said and what could be asked throughout the event. But I think these events have their place, but it needs to be truly transparent.
Absolutely, absolutely. And maybe I can close with an example that we actually do, which I think sits a little bit in the middle as well. It concerns one of our flagship journals, Diabetes, Obesity and Metabolism, where the editor-in-chief has actually developed a very interesting model whereby there will be a conversation potentially with a pharma company around a topic. He will go away and develop an outline, which would include, in this particular case, 4 review articles. the sponsor would, single or multi, would review the outline and potentially could tweak, but that's where any sort of input ends, because the commissioning of authors for the actual review articles is done by the editor-in-chief and not disclosed to the sponsor. So in effect, it's double blind. The authors do see the full outline, so they know what's happening between authorship. But it keeps a very interesting middle ground, I think, in developing IME content where there is a very top-line influence, or I shouldn't even call it influence, but a very top-line input from a potential sponsor. Making it multi-sponsored would certainly even further elevate it into the independent space, but not having sort of the insight into who would be authoring does help keep the independent nature of this. So I'm looking at my clock and it's just exactly 4 on my screen, which brings us to the end of today's webinar. Tia, Nina and Michael, I would like to thank you for your expertise and thought-provoking insights. I've certainly learned a lot, and as I hope the audience has too, from your experience and certainly your approach to IME and company-led. To our viewers, I'd like to say thank you. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. The on-demand recording of this webinar will be available shortly. Please feel free to share the link to this session amongst your peers. And if you'd like to receive additional information, or if you'd like us to, myself or perhaps even one of our panelists, to separately respond to your question, please feel free to email us and let us know. I believe this can be done through Reuters. And then that concludes our webinar today. Thank you again, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you and hearing you on our next webinar series.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.